So today I want to talk about this idea of Bitcoin isn't backed by anything, which we often hear. And I want to explore what do we mean by backed and what is Bitcoin backed by, if anything. So we often mean by backed, we mean government backed. And that used to be the gold standard of backing because gold standard meant that our currency was backed by gold. But that hasn't actually been the case since Nixon decoupled from the gold standard in 1971. So now we're relying on our government that is able to print money and issue debt, untethered and unfettered. And that government, let's say we need to focus on the US government specifically because the US dollar is the global reserve currency in which the vast majority of international trade is done. And the entire monetary system really rests on the foundation of the US government and the US government effectively managing the US dollar. That US government is in debt to the tune now of $38 trillion. That's the equivalent of $110,000, $111,000 per person in the US, $286,000 per household. China, Russia, India, Japan are no longer having the same faith in US treasuries and buying those treasuries and keeping them on their central bank balance sheets to the degree that they once did because they are losing faith in the US dollar to manage the system effectively, given this debt size and given the money printing that is happening to cover just the interest payments on the debt. The debt to GDP ratio is 124%. At 130%, it is generally considered unsustainable that the interest payments on the debt can no longer be made. So there's a lack of faith by large central banks and governments across the world in this monetary system, this fiat money by decree. That's what fiat means. It's by decree that we need to use this currency. And yet it seems to be quite a shaky foundation that by the evidence of the reduced international trade in US dollars and the reduced purchase of US treasuries is suggesting that perhaps this isn't as solid, this is no longer the gold standard that it once was. So that brings us to gold. What's gold backed by? Gold isn't backed by governments. Gold is historically used as currency. We experimented with it, came through via evolution, looking for a neutral, widely acceptable medium of exchange because barter is not terribly efficient or effective. And so we tried livestock and we tried grains and we tried metals, and ultimately we landed on gold for a couple of reasons. It doesn't rot like apples, it doesn't corrode like other metals, and it's also extremely scarce. It's scarcer than any other metal. And if we can pull metal out of the ground and the supply is almost unlimited or incredibly easy for everybody to access, then it doesn't have value. It's not scarce enough. It's anyone can get it, and I don't want your metal if I can get mine out of my own backyard. So scarcity matters. We moved away from that gold standard. It used to be that we had certificates that were backed by gold, and eventually they stopped being backed by gold. And so now they're just, if you like, pieces of paper not backed by anything except for the shaky government grounds. So let's move on to talk about Bitcoin. What's Bitcoin backed by? Bitcoin is backed primarily by maths. It is cryptographically locked. There's a consensus mechanism and it's open source software, so anybody can check this. And it means that millions of miners, nodes, users, developers across the world would need to unanimously agree to change anything in that code, which is frankly, well, nigh impossible. And so that code embeds a hard cap of 21 million Bitcoin that will ever be produced, making it the scarcest asset on earth, scarcer than even gold, because gold still comes out of the ground at the rate of 2% a year. So it's not absolutely hard capped. Bitcoin is also backed by, if you like, I guess what I've just been referring to is this massive decentralized network of nodes and miners that are all pulling together to validate and verify each individual transaction and the blockchain as a whole every 10 minutes. It makes it the most audited asset on earth. Every 10 minutes, every single transaction, every single block is being checked and rechecked and validated. Okay, it's also backed by energy. The amount of compute required by miners to hash a block to add to the blockchain with all the transactions in effect from the last 10 minutes is enormous. You would need the energy of the entire globe to break that or to change that in some way. So that energy usage that you hear about is a feature, not a bug. That is securing the network and securing the purity, if you like, of the blockchain and the transactions and the ledger that is being kept since 2009, every 10 minutes, every block. And then finally, I would suggest that it is backed by now government regulation and legislation that has come in around this industry, recognizing it as a legitimate asset class, a credible investment, and important new and unique asset class. And that has then brought in the confidence of not just individual investors, but institutional investors, hedge fund managers, asset managers, and even nation states putting Bitcoin on their balance sheets. And so what we've got is governments backing fiat, but those governments are looking a little uncertain, or those economies are looking shaky. And many governments across the world are losing trust and faith in the US dollar. You've got gold, which isn't entirely practical for day-to-day transactions. And that's why we moved away from the gold standard to begin with and started issuing certificates, because you can't really use it for international trade, particularly in the day and age of the internet when everything is happening in microseconds. And then you've got Bitcoin, backed by energy, backed by decentralization, backed by cryptography and maths, and now legislation and regulation. So I hope that gives you a valid basis for comparison to go forth and do your own research and to really take that as a framework within which to think about and consider what we're talking about when somebody comes to you and says it's not backed by anything, or when you have that thought that it's not backed by anything. Perhaps consider more broadly about what we mean by backed.